This is your reality check.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for January 9th, 2017, and since Darren is currently laying on a beach somewhere, this is producer Pat sitting in the host chair. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, cuboids?
Christina Roach.
Hey, checkers.
And luckily joining the panel is TRC's resident physics commando, Barry Panas.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Thanks for being here, Barry. We have three interesting segments for you today. Barry's going to discuss the physics of curling, and Adam is going to tell us whether or not the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention banned 7 words. But first, Cristina, what's going on with Gwyneth Paltrow and GOOP?
Here we go again. So I'm not sure whether to call this a debunking or a public service announcement. But we're only a few days into the new year, and Gwyneth Paltrow's aptly named lifestyle blog, GOOP, is already telling you to shove things in orifices. Now, in their 2018 GOOP Detox Shopping Guide, GOOP staff highly recommend something called an implant-orama, which sounds like a steal at $135 considering its health claims. You guys want to take a guess at what an implant-orama is?
No.
No, but I want one.
Oh, you might change your answer, Barry. It's a device used to give yourself an at-home coffee enema. What could possibly go wrong? In their deep detoxification guide, GOOP suggests that kicking off the year with a good old coffee enema is a, quote, clutch way to, quote, supercharge your health. Their Q&A page under the nuts and bolts of colonics is littered with nonsense, but they aren't the only ones who promote that a colon cleanse can treat a plethora of things from asthma to alcoholism to colitis. In an Ars Technica article that I reference quite a bit, Beth Moll succinctly puts it, quote, to be clear, the caffeinated deep toxification is a stupid and dangerous idea. I know we sound like a broken record, but there is no reason that anyone needs to detox unless A, you've been poisoned, or B, you have kidney or liver failure. Our bodies are designed to naturally get rid of toxins. Not to mention, not only is there no evidence to support detoxes and that they do anything beneficial for your health, there's a lot of evidence showing colon cleanses can actually be really, really harmful. Even though you can trace rectal cleansing back to the ancient Egyptians, we can trace everything back to the ancient Egyptians and Greeks, can't we? Coffee-related enemas seem to have popped up around 1917. And in 1920, some German scientists who were investigating caffeine's effect on the small intestines and bile duct proposed, in short, coffee enemas absorbed through the colon stimulated the liver more effectively to clear toxins. Now later, some smart scientists figured out this wasn't true. Then for some crazy reason, in the 90s, some very unqualified people convinced some other people that colon cleansing could be used as an effective alternative cancer treatment, which is sad and, very scary.
Very dangerous. Oh, yeah.
Claims were that coffee enemas detoxified metabolic products of tumors, which, let's be clear, there's no medical evidence to support any anti-cancer effects from having a coffee enema. Coffee enemas and colonics were literally referred to as quackery in a doctor's 1997 editorial in the Journal of Clinical Gastroenterology during the resurgence of colon cleansing for wellness purposes. In fact, there are several harmful side effects from getting a coffee enema, including infections and rectal perforations. Those are just a couple. I mean, the others are pretty scary too.
So if you're trying to use it for colitis, you'll end up with worse colitis.
Exactly.
Very bad.
Another terrible side effect is severe electrolyte imbalances, causing the US FDA to rule that study participants must be warned at the risk of death from coffee enemas in studies that use them. Yet GOOP still promotes the implant-orama. Now, if you go to the actual site of the product, the company's claims about coffee enemas are equally dubious. Quote, relief from depression, confusion, general nervous tension, many allergy-related symptoms, and most importantly, relief from severe pain. Coffee enemas lower serum toxins. Whatever the hell that means.
I'm surprised weight loss isn't in that list. You'd certainly be lighter from all the money that you've lost.
This is true, Barry.
Yep.
One small consolation, very small, is there is a detailed disclaimer that quickly follows, citing that their information is not intended to replace your medical doctor, nor has the info been approved by the FDA.
That sounds like just a legal kind of catch-all to not get in trouble.
Oh, you just wait, Adam Gardner. It gets better. Probably my favorite line in their disclaimer is that their claims are, quote, not necessarily based on scientific evidence from any source, nor intended to treat, diagnose, mitigate, prevent, or cure any condition or disease. The company ends the disclaimer by stating, using this site for any purpose whatsoever, you are agreeing to indemnify Implantorama LLC from any claims or responsibility for anything, and that you accept sole responsibility for any legal, medical, or financial liability which may occur as a result of your usage of the products on this site. So basically, loose translation, hey, this product doesn't do anything that we claim it does in the description part where we're trying to sell it to you, but by adding this disclaimer, we're covering our own asses when something goes wrong with yours.
Right. With yours.
Sounds like everybody should be covering their ass with this product.
So this brings up the question, what does this actually look like? It's like some sort of funnel that you put in your butt?
It's actually, for $135, you get a glass jar with a couple of tubes sticking out of it.
Is there like a pump or something like that?
Yeah, like a little pump on one end that, you know.
Okay.
Now, Dr. Jen Gunter, as you may expect, did a great breakdown of this a few days ago on her blog, which we link to in our show notes. She starts off with an interesting observation, actually. Here's a quote from Gunter. It seems January is Gwyneth Paltrow's go-to month for promoting dangerous things that should not go in or near an orifice. January 2016 brought us vagina steaming. January 2017 brought us jade eggs. And here we are in the early days of January 2018 and Goop.com's hawking coffee enemas and promoting colonic irrigation.
I wonder if that's strategic, if it's like, you know, people make New Year's resolutions to be healthy or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. It's their, you know, the kick off the new year, healthy new you type thing. Gunter specifically cites the Q&A Goop does with LA-based cardiologist Dr. Alejandro Younger, who helped develop the Goop vitamin supplement protocol. The Q&A is found on the nuts and bolts of Colonics page that I mentioned earlier. Gunter points out how it is filled with information that is, quote, unsupported by both the medical literature and by human anatomy and physiology. There is no data to suggest that a colonic helps with the elimination of the waste that is transiting the colon on its way out. Now here's an excerpt from her blog post. Dr. Younger tells us via Goop that a cleanse creates some kind of extra sticky mucus that blocks elimination of what needs to be disposed of. Dr. Younger says this cleanse residual is a mucoid plaque, basically some kind of adherent cleanse-induced superglue that needs a colonic for removal. He supports this assertion not with published research, but by telling Goop's readers to literally Google mucoid plaque. Do you guys want to know what the first thing that comes up when you Google mucoid plaque is?
Again, no.
Goop or their website?
Goop, I'm going to guess.
Nope. It's a definition of mucoid plaque.
Yep.
Mucoid plaque, or mucoid cap or rope, is a pseudoscientific term used by some alternative medicine advocates to describe what is claimed to be a combination of allegedly harmful mucus-like material and food residue that they say coats the gastrointestinal tract of most people.
Maybe you should ask people to Bing it instead.
Yeah. I'm totally with you on that one. There isn't one study or even case report to be found describing the phenomenon of mucoid plaques. And Gunter talks about going to PubMed and doing some searches on this as well. This term was apparently coined by a naturopath named Richard Anderson and not any doctor who actually specializes at looking in colons. Gunter goes on to reiterate the serious risks to colonics and that coffee enemas and colonics offer no health benefits. So there you have it, checkers. Keep the coffee in your cup and nobody gets hurt.
The origin of this segment is a conversation I had with my father about curling. Shout out to Big Mike. He mentioned that sweeping in the sport was a really good workout, but it got me thinking about how the sweeping affects the rock and how much of a difference it actually makes. Barry Panas is a high school physics teacher in Winnipeg. He's also a former president of the Manitoba Association of Physics Teachers, an advanced placement physics college board consultant, and he's traveled around the world giving training for advanced placement physics teachers. So Barry, what can you tell us about the physics of curling?
Well, okay, so to explain the physics of the sweeping part especially, we're going to have to first understand just the physics of curling itself. So how about if we start with that and kind of come to the sweeping part in a minute?
Sounds great.
So there's an easy part and there's a hard part. If you understand the easy part, it'll make it that much smoother of a transition to get to the hard part. So here's the easy part. Imagine something like a cup on your table, and imagine that you push that cup away from yourself so that it slides forwards, and at the same time, just as you let it go, you give it a clockwise rotation. Can you visualize that okay?
So far, so good.
Okay, so if you were able to do that, just kind of sliding it across the table, what would be your prediction as to any kind of interesting behavior of the cup as it moves away from you?
So I'll say that it's going to move forward and curl in the direction that it's being spun.
So would it, from your point of view, go to your left or to your right?
Clockwise. So I would say it would spin to the right.
I would say it would spin to the left.
I would say it would go to the right, and also because it's a glass of water, there's going to be some sloshing, so there's going to be some sort of like going and stopping that's probably not present inside a non-liquid curling rock.
Let's just imagine an empty cup. So then it would go to the
right, I believe.
To the right, you believe? Okay, well, I'd encourage you to try it, and anybody who's listening to the show, I'd really encourage you to hit pause and give it some thought and actually give it a go, because it's really easy to do that. If you do, you'll actually find, without a doubt about it, that it will, in that case, veer off to your left.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so let's see if we can make sense of this. Why would it veer off to your left as opposed to just kind of going straight ahead from you? Okay, so visualize this. The part of the cup that would be closest to you would be sliding to your left. The part of the cup that's farthest from you would be sliding to your right. So far, so good?
Yeah.
Okay, now the part that is sliding to your left is in effect pushing the table to the left, and because of that, the table pushes the cup to the right. Meanwhile, on the front edge, the exact opposite's happening. The front edge is pushing the table to the right because it's sliding that way, and the table pushes it to the left. So, summary, just in case you're losing track, front edge gets pushed by the table to the left, and the back edge gets pushed by the table to the right. Okay, now, if there was no funny business, we might expect that those two would be the same size and they would cancel each other out in effect and lead to no interesting effect. But here's the deal. As the cup is dragging along and slowing down, the front edge kind of has extra weight bearing down on it as the cup tends to somewhat lean forward as it slows down. So there's extra weight bearing down on the front, even if the cup itself is just assumed to be symmetric. That extra weight bearing down on the front means that that front edge effect dominates. And so that will indeed push the cup to the left. How does that sound?
Makes sense. I just didn't account for that kind of leaning effect.
Yeah, that leaning is quite important to understand this.
Mm-hmm. For me, it's counterintuitive. I definitely need to get a glass and spin it, but I follow you so far.
Okay, so that was the easy part. Here's the hard part. A curling stone will go the exact opposite direction.
Okay. I'm sure you can tell us why.
Well, and that's definitely
less friction.
Well, okay, so you might at first start by saying, well, why doesn't the curling rock exhibit the same behavior? Everything that we said should apply equally well, and for the most part, it does, with an important difference. Unlike your cup on the table, the curling rock is sliding on ice, and ice has the ability to melt, thereby reducing the friction.
Ah.
So there's a trace amount of liquid water that is kind of sitting on top of the ice as it kind of slides by, and that acts as a lubricant. So in a somewhat paradoxical manner, that extra weight bearing down on the front leads to melting of the ice, which leads to decreased friction on the front, meaning that the dominant effect is what's happening at the back end.
So why isn't
Right.
that melted ice also melted when the back end crosses?
Well, the reason it melts predominantly at the front end is actually a couple of reasons. Number one is that leaning forward itself, that extra weight bearing down on it, further enhances the melting of the ice. There's also another little bit more subtle. This one's a bit harder to explain without a visual. But if that was sliding as described, so it's sliding away from you while rotating clockwise, the left edge of the rock would be moving extra fast across the ice surface, and the right edge would be moving somewhat slower, because it's moving in the direction opposite of the sliding rock, whereas the left edge is actually moving forwards. So the left edge is actually moving quicker. There's even further friction on the left edge, or at least more energy being transferred on the left edge, and that melted water on the left edge can actually be brought forward as it rotates to place some water underneath the front of the rock, further reducing the friction.
Interesting.
Wow.
So there actually is quite a bit of physics going on here. But the long and the short of it is, the reason that a curling rock curls in the first place is because of that interesting frictional effect. Where there's more friction, you get more curling. And where there's less friction, you get less of an effect.
I just learned why it's called curling.
It is literally called curling because it curls.
All right.
Today I learned.
Okay, so that's just the physics of curling, no sweeping involved. All right, now, because of this all comes down to frictional effects, the question of does sweeping do anything in the first place, I think was the question, is there anything happening there? The answer is yes, no doubt about it. The sweeping does affect the motion of the rock, predominantly in two different ways. But both due to the same fundamental principle. By sweeping the ice, you're actually bearing down your own weight on it, and the friction of your rubbing back and forth somewhat warms up the ice and can actually melt a trace layer of it, reducing all of those effects that we just talked about, meaning that the rock will not only go further because there's less friction overall, but it will also curl less and therefore go straighter.
Right.
Cool.
So you can change the trajectory of the rock and not just how far it's going to go.
Yeah, and as far as I could tell, curling is the only sport that the athletes in the sport can actually influence the motion of their projected object. In this case, it's a curling stone, but think of it as being analogous to a ball. They can influence its motion after it's been released.
Right. Yeah.
Wow, interesting.
So the answer to your question is, yeah, sweeping definitely does have an effect. If the curlers want the rock to go straighter, they will sweep more, and if they want it to curl more, they'll sweep less.
So clearly the sweeping can affect the rock barrier, but do we know how significantly? Is it a significant difference?
Yes, it can be quite significant. One of the sources that I came across claimed as much as 2 meters, roughly 6 feet of curl, which is to say that it would go sideways that much from the straight line path that it otherwise would have moved through. Also, because of the sweeping, it would go farther by as much as 3 meters, or roughly 10 feet.
With other mediums, I guess it all depends. You know, if you have say a toboggan on snow that's spinning versus an inner tube on water, are you going to have, some are going to behave like the cup and some are going to behave like the curling rock, depending on various factors?
I would think that predominantly the cup is going to be more likely to be the model that you would go with. The curling rock does have this very unusual feature of changing the friction due to that melting of the ice. So if you had something else sliding on ice, I think you're going to expect behavior quite like the curling rock. But if you have anything sliding across a solid or something that's already a liquid, then I would expect it to behave more like the cup.
I feel like humans have a natural expectation for certain physical things, like how a ball is going to fall or something like that. But I guess if you're an expert curler, you're kind of your intuition about that is going to be wrong for most things. I don't know how useful that is in everyday life to spin a cup on a table and things like that, right?
Well, certainly if you had anything else that was sliding across ice and rotating as it did so, I would expect it to move in a similar way to the curling rock. But if anything else was sliding across a surface that is more conventional, something that's just a straight up solid that doesn't have this ability to melt so easily, then I would expect it to behave much more like the cup. The only exception that I can maybe think to, it would be quite a bit different, mind you, is something like a curveball in baseball. Now, of course, in that case, the baseball is not in contact with any solid. It's just moving through the air. But it might be worth just pointing out here that the spin of the ball would interact with the air in a way that's more analogous to the way the curling rock moves, in that a rotation that is clockwise as seen from above from a ball that is thrown forwards would indeed cause that ball to curve in the same kind of fashion that the curling rock would curve. But of course, that's a very different physics interacting with the air.
From curling to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Adam, I definitely saw this in the news. Is this true?
So like Pat, you may have heard in the news recently that last month the Trump administration banned the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, from using the following 7 words: vulnerable, entitlement, diversity, transgender, fetus, evidence-based, and science-based. So when I saw this, I was kind of incensed. So there was a lot of buzz about this on social media. People who, if the claims were true, should rightfully be upset about it. As fans of science and evidence-based policies and decisions here on the show, I was particularly surprised to see a seemingly anti-reality ban. My first reaction was, if you're actually banning evidence-based and science-based, you're really saying you're bullshit, right?
I hate to say, Adam, it didn't completely surprise me, considering everything that's been going on.
It's not the first anti-science policy the Trump administration would have done. We can say it that way to be kind. Other terms clearly spit in the face of liberal social issues, with transgender rights, abortion, and minority groups being pretty much something that you couldn't talk about if this is true. Now, the news coverage on this issue was quite clear on the source of these banned words. The Washington Post, which broke the story, clearly stated, and I quote, "The Trump administration is prohibiting officials at the nation's top public health agency from using a list of 7 words or phrases, including fetus and transgender, in official documents being prepared for next year's budget." When asked for comment, the CDC repeatedly denied that there were any banned words. Now, all the other news sources that covered it pretty much said similar things. The HHS, that's the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees the CDC, stated, "The assertion that HHS has banned words is a complete mischaracterization of discussions regarding the budget formulation process. HHS will continue to use the best scientific evidence available to improve the health of all Americans. HHS also strongly encourages the use of outcome and evidence data in program evaluations and budget decisions." The director of the CDC, Brenda Fitzgerald, took to Twitter to say, "I want to assure you that there are no banned words at CDC. We will continue to talk about all our important public health programs." So, what's going on? We have this article saying one thing, we have the CDC officials saying others. What's the real story? The Washington Post article cites that their anonymous source mentioned that the banned word list came from Allison Kelly, who they refer to as a career civil servant, meaning she's not part of the Trump administration. I found some explanation of this from the National Review. Now, this is a right-wing publication, so it isn't exactly an unbiased source. It's the kind of thing I usually like to reference on the show. The author of this particular piece, Yuval Levin, does not appear to be a fan of Trump or the Trump administration. Yuval Levin has previously worked at the White House and HHS during the Bush administration, so he has contacts, though naturally these will likely be conservative contacts. He reached out to them to try to get a full picture of what was really going on. Basically, he heard this and he thought it didn't really make a lot of sense and he wanted the full story. So, what he determined was that this is about a sort of style guide for budget proposals and congressional justifications documents. So these aren't words to avoid when contacting the public, but when writing certain types of internal documentation to try to get funding. Such style guides were apparently used before, including during the Obama administration, but the words described were not in the previous administration's guide. The story applied differently to 2 sets of words. Only 3 had been explicitly mentioned in writing as something to avoid in such documents, and these were vulnerable, diversity, and entitlement. They were not terms which were prohibited, but the style guide suggests that they be used when alternatives could not be found. So they're not banned. The article's author then goes on to give reasons for which these might want to be avoided. This is speculation on his part. But For example, vulnerable, when used by the CDC, could lose the meaning of someone who is poor or vulnerable socially, and could also mean vulnerable to a disease or illness. This could lead to confusion either way, so in either context it might be a good idea to avoid using it, or use more specific terminology. Either say what they are vulnerable to, or just use a different word altogether. Entitlement isn't really that controversial a term. Diversity could simply be a word that might not be expected to go over too well with congressional Republicans. Now, there was a meeting to discuss these guidelines, and it seems that in that meeting, there was a discussion about potential other terms that it might be best to avoid. This meeting did not include any political appointees. This means that it was not represented by anyone in the Trump administration. Now, it was a meeting amongst CDC civil servants who throughout their career could work for many different administrations. So I work for the government, other people on the show work for the government, but they're not representing any political party in their job, right? So that kind of thing. Yuval Levin, the author, did not speak to anyone who was in this meeting. He did speak with people who discussed the issue with the person who led it. Now, in this meeting, the other terms were brought up, those being transgender, fetus, evidence-based, and science-based, those being, obviously, some of the more controversial ones that most people were enraged about. So that's where these terms actually had come up, according to his contacts. If this is correct, the Trump administration had nothing to do with dictating those specific terms. Some lower-level CDC employees felt they should be avoided because they would raise red flags with Republicans. Now, there's a pretty big fundamental difference here. The main assessment of most of the media and the reason for incensed social media users and people like me being really mad about it was that this direction came from Donald Trump or someone in his administration, and that appears to be incorrect. This would appear to be some employees who are advocating self-censorship to increase the chances that their budget proposals would get approved, which is less controversial. It's still kind of annoying, and it's kind of like them saying, I don't really trust the administration to let this pass, but that is a totally different angle. This explanation seems to jive well with a statement that the CDC's director, Brenda Fitzgerald, sent to Snopes. Snopes had an article on it, but they didn't say yes or no as a definite, they're fake or this is real. And I quote again here, "I understand that confusion arose from a staff-level discussion at a routine meeting about how to present CDC's budget. It was never intended as overall guidance for how we describe and conduct CDC's work." And the previously mentioned comment by the CDC, "The assertion that HHS has banned words is a complete mischaracterization of discussions regarding the budget formulation process." So, whose side is the truth? We have one anonymous source stating something to the Washington Post, and we have Yuval Levin contacting a number of anonymous sources, which creates a picture which is actually pretty consistent with what we'd already heard, but clarified some important points, that these words aren't actually banned, and that many of them don't even come from the Trump administration. The CDC does not seem to have banned these 7 terms. They've actually used some of them in their responses to claims that they were. So if they ever would have had any plan to ban them, they certainly aren't. The CDC denies that they are banned, and it seems likely only a much less controversial set of words, vulnerable, diversity, and entitlement, are explicitly mentioned in a style guide as mere suggestions for what could work in a subset of budget documents and not for general CDC work, definitely not for talking to the public. Further, it seems, based on claims by other employees at HHS, that the most controversial of these terms, that being transgender, fetus, evidence-based, and science-based, were brought up at a meeting amongst civil servants which did not include representatives of the Trump administration and were likely described as terms which one might want to avoid as they set off red flags for Republicans. Now, Donald Trump and his administration have done a lot of terrible things, and they've done a lot of terrible things for science, so we don't have to believe things that aren't really true.
Yeah, and that's definitely a problem. It's pretty irresponsible of WAPO to go out saying that, hey, these are a list of banned words from CDC.
I think
really disappointing.
I think their contact probably expressed it like that, and it probably was just an employee who heard it in this meeting and really was kind of incensed about it. But when you look at the big picture, it's like if I was sitting at a meeting at work and someone said something I didn't like, and then I wrote a letter to the newspaper about it, but then it turned out it doesn't come from Justin Trudeau. It just comes from some other guy I work with. So it's tricky, and it's hard to know what exactly happens because like these aren't public meetings, and there may not necessarily be a record of it. And when we talk about, here's what people said after the fact, it's hard to know for sure. But it sounds like a lot of the fuss about this wasn't really warranted.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks for listening. Today we found out that you should keep coffee in your cup and out of your butt.
Sound advice.
That the physics of curling is far more complicated than you thought, and that the CDC didn't really ban 7 words in the way that you heard about in the news.
Right.
Barry, where can people find you?
Probably the best bet would be the YouTube channel. That would be great if you could throw a link out somewhere.
We absolutely will. So until next week, on behalf of Darren, I'll say think better to act better.
Peace out, Cuboids.
Stay classy, not smart-assy.
Thanks again for having me.
Thanks for being here, Barry.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.